So we were in the middle of talking about the importance and responsibilities of the very well-educated, often very impressive Puritan ministers, and they had a powerful role to play, but their uh, authority was limited, and this will be a give us a transition into Puritan politics and government because there's kind of a crossover or spillover effect, I think, here. Ministers were not allowed to hold public office, so there was, and vice versa. So there was a firewall kind of put up between the two. The Puritan churches were at least nominally, uh, legally, sort of free from state control. There was some sometimes unofficial fudging of that, actually quite a few times, but nonetheless, is I think an important principle. The church also had the authority to hold political leaders accountable on religious matters, not on criminal matters, but on church transgressions, which could get you at worst excommunicated from the church, which is a much more serious thing for somebody in those days. Doesn't sound that than it would be today. It sounds, who cares? I got kicked out of the church. I'll go to another one. Well, sometimes there wasn't another one, and you might be shunned by the entire community if you got excommunicated. There is a famous example of this. Governor Winthrop's church, forget which one in Boston, might have been First Boston. I guess it was because he was there at the beginning, so it must have been First Boston. But they actually brought him up on charges, and he was acquitted. But they went through this whole sort of church trial. Again, it wasn't a criminal trial, but it was for offenses kind of against the church, and he did win. Was it because of his authority, that he sort of didn't get punished? Maybe. But it's actually, I think, incredible that they even went as far as charging him and holding like a trial, a hearing on the whole thing. And they did. So they were there to hold even the powerful, nobody was more powerful than Winthrop, accountable on religious matters. Which, what I'm saying is, I think is how we explain, or it's a big part of the explanation for how it was that the Puritans became so democratic in their thinking, that their government became so much about participatory government. It's partly because their religion already was sort of moving in a democratic direction, and so unintentionally, without maybe even realizing it, it spilled over into their political views and political structures as well, because holding people accountable is part of democratic practice and thinking and participatory government. So members had the power to dismiss the saints, could dismiss the ministers. Members were encouraged to participate, ask questions, hold their own religious discussion groups, even express different views within limits. Remember, I said earlier that though the Puritans were intolerant in extreme ways sometimes, there was a certain element of tolerance as well. Here's one of the places that you can see it. If they were totally intolerant of other people's views, particularly religious views, they certainly wouldn't allow their members, the average citizens or saints, to hold their own religious meetings in their households because they couldn't control them. Who knows what somebody might say and think, and it might cause all kinds of problems. And there were some rules. I mean, you couldn't necessarily enforce them, but most people kind of self-enforced them. There were limits to sort of what you could discuss or how far it could go in criticizing or deviating from what was considered standard. But all societies have basic limits. We have freedom of speech in this country, but there are some things that in certain circles that would be sort of not cool, not okay to say, at least as far as the social mores, cultural mores of the time. So they were no different. Okay, you can discuss, you can disagree, you can debate religious issues, religious doctrines. You just can't go too far with it. But that's still a form of toleration, even if it's limited toleration. No minister was more powerful than the rest. We already know this because there wasn't any overriding body, right? Each church was basically sovereign. The congregational system, right? There was no higher church authority to appeal to. So the minister in one church is exactly equal to a minister in another one, the one down the street, the other side of town. Each church had the kind of individual autonomy, again, not controlled by high authority. Uh, Church authority was based on mutual and free consent. So at the bottom, I ask, and you already know what my answer is, did the structure of their churches influence their political structures? Of course they did. I mean, they were being built at the same time, so maybe it's going back and forth to some degree. There's a mutual influence there. Nonetheless, I think that the answer still is yes to that question. The question of ordered liberty, as I said before, the phrase is still used today. There are books about ordered liberty, but the Puritans were among the first peoples in the European world, let alone the colonial world, to struggle with this issue 100 or more years before the founding fathers of our country. As Professor Hall says, another expert on the Puritans in a recent book, godly rule was about liberty and being liberated, but it was also about obligation and obedience. To understand godly rule was to cast off every corrupt form of authority and install structures and practices mandated by a sovereign Christ. And he goes on to say, thus did authority and liberty become intertwined. To treat them as opposites, either in thinking or the practice of the colonists, is probably the most serious mistake we can make. Obligation and limits are the crucial middle terms that inflect these categories, combining liberty and authority without allowing either to veer off into excess. So, to simplify that, the Puritans were kind of on the cutting edge on yet another matter, ahead of their time, in trying to grapple with how do we balance the need for law and order and authority on one side so we don't have anarchy and chaos, and liberty or freedom on the other side so people can have their adhere to their rights, or have society adhere to their rights, to not infringe on people's natural, as they saw them, rights and liberties. So they didn't necessarily have all the answers to the questions, though they had some. But the fact that they took it so seriously, was showing that they were doing quite advanced political thought and theory in the 17th century. Godly republicanism, as it was sometimes called, Puritan representative or democratic government. There was a creative tension then between order and liberty. So Francis Bremer, another one of our experts we've been quoting, godly rule meant they had no qualms about their religious beliefs influencing New England governments. As much as possible, the Puritans tried to bring public life into conformity with their view of God's law. And we already know this as well. There's some repeat in here, but that's only good for remembering this stuff, understanding it. But we already know this because we know the Puritans were trying to create not just good religious institutions, good, how they defined it, but social, political, economic institutions, cultural institutions around their religion that fit neatly with their religious views and practice. So ordered liberty, back to Hall, obligation and limits are the crucial middle terms, right? So there are obligations, there are limits. This is true even now. Americans, I think, often, particularly Americans, often modern day Americans, misinterpret liberty and freedom. They think it means I get to do whatever I want, whenever I want to. Well, of course, there are laws that get in the way of that already, but there are other, I think, limits as well. Society's expectations, your family's expectations, some of which you're free to reject, but there's still pressures on you, and they still place limitations in most people's minds. So limits are there. Freedom is not defined by, or liberty, by just doing whatever I want all the time. Could be, but that's not how it's usually been thought about, at least by responsible people, deep thinkers on the subject. The Puritan experience in England had certainly made them wary of too much sort of government authority. So we see them developing the concept of liberty, or sort of further developing it, partly because they had been persecuted to some degree in England. Not persecuted in the sense that they were executed by the authorities, imprisoned and killed, as in sort of early Christian days in the Roman Empire. but they were still kind of hounded out of positions in the church if they were known to be preaching sort of the Puritan way instead of the 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 doctrines of the Anglican Church, the official religion of England. So because they were suspicious of government sort of stepping on what they saw as their liberties to practice religion that they want to, not surprisingly, that liberty becomes a huge concept in their societies, not just in religion, but sort of across the board. One of the common misconceptions about Puritan New England is, or Massachusetts Bay as an example, is that it was a theocracy. Theocracy means a system where the government and the church authorities are the same. They're one and the same thing. But that's not true. We already saw that ministers couldn't be politicians and vice versa. However, it's not separation of church and state entirely either. This is on the slide, because though the two were separate, formally speaking, informally, it's true. There are plenty of occasions where the governments and the religious leaders got together and said, hey, we need to work on this together, help each other out here for this reason. Even though it wasn't official, doing it unofficially still had a semblance of connection between the church on one side, the state on the other. So it was neither a theocracy or not separation of church and state either, sort of something other in between. The Massachusetts Bay Colony's government was known as the General Court. They didn't mean court necessarily in the judicial sense of the word, like I'm going to court before a judge and all that, though there was a sort of appeals court that was part of this. It was just sort of the name for the government. And the structure of Massachusetts Bay was somewhat different than the other New England Puritan colonies, but this will give us a good sense of how they were overall organized. So this is Massachusetts Bay's structure. There was a governor, a deputy governor, a bicameral legislature, meaning two houses. They were copying what they knew, England's House of Lords, House of Commons. There was an upper house, a lower house. The upper house was the Court of Appeal as well. For court cases, sort of got up to them. Widespread voting. Usually all the male saints could vote. So if you were a saint, member of the church, then you could also vote. There's not 100% correspondence there, but pretty close. So if you were a basic townsman, that you got to remember the church, you got to vote. So they were pretty much one and the same. Just to give us a sense on this slide before I move to the next one, this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with democracy here per se, except to say that there were elections for these positions. The legislature implies elections, and the governor himself was elected and had to be reelected every single year. They didn't do 2-year terms, 4-year terms, 6-year terms. They did a 1-year term. So that's democratic. If there's a wide group of people voting, and certainly women weren't voting, slaves weren't voting, so it wasn't as wide as it could or should be, but it was still wider than it was in most places in Europe. But for a governor to have to stand for re-election every year is quite democratic. You could argue that it's not very efficient, because if it's a new guy every time, you have to train them, and by the time they figure out the job, their term's already over. Although you could run again. Governor Berkeley won most of the time, so he would, be governor for many years in a row. But there were occasions where he'd lose in a given year and sit out for a year or two and come back. So through his long tenure as governor, he was in office as governor most of the time, but there were a few little places in there, if you look at the record, where he lost on a few occasions. So say what you will about this system, but it's just the fact that the governor has to be elected every year shows you how much of a move towards democracy this really was. There was local government, so two levels of government. We usually think of our system today as having 3 levels: national government, state government, and like local city government. They had 2 levels. The colonial-wide government, which we just looked at, the general court, and local government. Local government usually dealt with sort of 2 things: land, distribution and sales, and taxes. Both of them huge issues. So those issues are pretty much handled by local government, which means local government was involved in some pretty important stuff. And this is the part of early New England's history, the early Puritans' history in New England, that usually gets the most attention, and for good reason. If the colonial government was moving in the direction of representative government democracy, at the local level, it's even more true. The town meeting system is what gets even the most attention from there. So we're kind of zeroing in even more. Selectmen meant the voters in the towns. They held town meetings. The officials held town meetings. And what is that? How is that democratic? Well, it even kind of sounds democratic. Think about it, right? What would you picture happening at a town meeting? What is that, and what does it even mean to say, "Hey, we're having a town meeting"? It sounds inclusive, and it was astonishingly so. So anybody could show up to the town meeting and throw in their 2 cents. Now, that's not to say that a poor farmer would have the same weight in the issue or debate as, say, a rich lawyer or businessman in the town. He probably wouldn't. But the very fact that he got to go to the meeting at all, the poor farmer, and participate, listen, maybe even speak, is astonishingly open and inclusive. Just to give us something to bounce this off of, we've already covered Virginia. There was nothing like a town meeting system in Virginia. Nothing. The elite, grandee, gentry landowners there, we've already talked about. These snooty guys, they never had meetings where they invited the average people. Never. Never, never, never. So this is quite incredible. The selectmen then made the decisions for the town after being voted in by the members of the town. Professor Rourke says New England town meetings routinely practiced a level of popular participation in political life that was unprecedented elsewhere in the world in the 17th century. He throws that statement kind of as almost a throwaway line in there, but look at what he's saying there. It was just easy to pass over that. He's saying popular participation basically means democracy, that they're practicing a level of democracy that was unprecedented elsewhere in the whole world in the 17th century. He doesn't say whole, but that's what he means. So he's right. This is something quite unique and quite amazing for the time period. And again, we'll see a couple other colonies that pop up after the New England ones that are moving towards democracy as well, but maybe none more so than this. And this, of course, has an influence going forward. So now we get to the chronological part of this. We look at some of the events, and most of these we'll go through pretty quickly. There's a couple that I need to linger on a little longer. The errand into the wilderness. The Puritans, this phrase has been sort of synonymous with the Puritans ever since. It wasn't, of course, a wilderness because Native Americans already lived there. Wilderness territory means uninhabited. But from the Puritan perspective, they saw it that way, partly because they discounted Native Americans, as human beings, or at least saw them as lesser human beings because of racist beliefs and views. So they called this the errand into the wilderness. Right? But in this sense, you can see how they rightly thought of it as a frontier for them. It was an unknown, at least to the Puritans when they first got there. So the founding of Plymouth Colony is kind of our starting point, 1620. I didn't really talk about that colony, which is funny because it's the most famous of all the New England colonies early on because of Plymouth Rock, first Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims. It's part of our national sort of mythology. But it's not as important as Massachusetts Bay, which came about 10 years later, the one that included John Winthrop and built the city of Boston. There are 2 cases of importance to come up here, Roger Williams' case and Anne Hutchinson. Those are the 2 of the 3 things we have to linger on. But let's come back to that. So we dealt with that. We'll come back to this and Anne Hutchinson. There was a written law code in 1641, the first written law code in the New World. And this is kind of like a Bill of Rights that would serve to protect citizens' rights, which again, I think you can kind of see as, in a way, modern, and it was ahead of its time. 5 years after that came the Cambridge Platform, which is one of the first written rules for churches, which shows us that their early idea of having purely congregational structure to their churches, which meant there's no higher authority, required to list a few more rules because of the propensity for things to get out of hand and there to be no guidance and direction, though there still was a lot of independence. There was a very serious set of circumstances in 1659 and 1660, around mid-century, when a number of Quakers in the Massachusetts Bay Colony caused a stir simply by practicing Quakerism, which, by the way, in many ways is similar to Puritanism, but nonetheless just different enough that it brought the authorities down on the heads of those who were sort of caught practicing Quakerism. Here's where we can see Puritan intolerance, to be sure, and in this case leading to execution of a handful of people, including the famous Mary Dyer. However, if you look at the transcript on the left, her being interviewed after she was captured, along with male counterparts that were captured and executed as well, after being tried, convicted, executed. In a sense, she was an intentional martyr for the cause. The truth is, they warned her many times. She'd been arrested for practicing Quakerism once, and banished from the colony, saying, "Okay, we'll let you go, but get out of here, don't come back." She and her followers and colleagues came back again, and the Puritans were intolerant, and as I said, sort of tolerant at the same time. They didn't just arrest you, try you, convict you, and hang you, except maybe in the Salem witch trials when things got really, really out of hand. They tended to try to find middle of the road solutions. There's a lot of dialogue that went on. John Wilson, you see in the lower right, the minister at First Congregational Church of Boston during these earlier years, was sent out to sort of talk to Mary Dyer again and again and again. And they'd say things just like, "Look, I know you really believe these things, and that's fine. Just renounce them in front of the court or whatever, and you won't get executed. Just do that." And she and the others refused and wouldn't do it. So you can, and I'm saying this legitimately, you can of course admire them for be willing to die for their convictions. True. But you could also see them as rather, you could see them as zealots for sort of, extremists. Wait a minute, you had a number of chances to kind of get out of this, and you could have compromised a little bit. Nope, I'm holding to my, my views. So there's a number of ways to look at all of this. The Halfway Covenant in 1662, and the issue of declension. The Halfway Covenant came about around this time because many of the original saints, the original members of the church, their children, and eventually their grandchildren, when they were coming of age, weren't quite as into religion as their parents had been, and so weren't as qualified to become saints or members, and then weren't members. And it was becoming somewhat of a scandal and an embarrassment because so many of these people who were in, saints in very good standing with the church couldn't get their children even baptized because they weren't church members. And so there was a great, intense and heated debate over this because what was proposed as a solution is what's known as the Halfway Covenant. And this basically meant that there were sort of two factions among the leaders about what to do about this. One basically said nothing. One side said nothing. If they can't qualify, then they don't qualify. If it's a minority of the population that are church members, then so be it. But the other side said halfway covenant. We need to water our standards down. We need to make it easier for people to kind of pass, our various tests to let more people become members. Kind of there was a fear that among those that were opposed to the halfway covenant, and it's divided kind of close to half, though it did pass in the end. But those on the more conservative, kind of old-fashioned side said, no way, right? We can't have this kind of lukewarm attachment to the church and lukewarm, belief in God and commitment to Christianity. It's got to be, sort of the real deal, like it was for me and my father, et cetera, et cetera. But those that were, in a sense, trying to be more practical. So now we have to make a compromise here. We're going to have to sort of, again, lighten up on the entrance requirements for membership in the church. But this sort of rattled the cage of the Massachusetts Bay Colony by mid-century. And this is where we get to the declension. To many, this seemed like a possible sign that God doesn't favor us, right? And never did. Maybe we've been under an illusion this whole time, or a delusion, that we were all, or most of us were, already predestined into heaven. And now this comes along. Maybe we weren't. So back to that kind of worry, anxiety again about predestination. And this time in a general or a collective sense, not an individual one. So Rourke says the halfway covenant generated a controversy that sputtered through Puritan churches for the remainder of the century. So this didn't go away. The bad blood created on both sides, because they vehemently opposed each other, stuck. And so there was kind of constant fear in the air going forward, not just over the issue, but about this might be a sign that we're in decline. That's what declension means. Our church is in decline. God, maybe we never did have his favor. The next events didn't make it any better in that sense. King Philip's War, 1675, not the first time the Puritans of New England had fought a bloody war against Native Americans, but coming at this time, it was sort of another body blow to Puritan confidence that they were doing right by God, and God was good with their own efforts. So this is a brutal, bloody war. King Philip was the English name for one of the most important of the powerful Native American chiefs. The war ended up being won by the English, but enormous destruction really on both sides. John Eliot, in the bottom left, did actually come to New England to try to convert Native Americans. We know was the case in every European colony where Native Americans lived, or that was their homeland, of course. But Eliot was a little bit successful. We know Native Americans weren't usually wild about Christianity. He did something somewhat new here. He established praying towns. So instead of missionaries going out to homes and communities of Native Americans, he sort of had them come to sort of like one camp and sort of try to convert them all together at the same time. From our perspective today, this all looks arrogant, racist, elitist, Eurocentric, Anglocentric, and it is in a sense. But keep in mind that Eliot, whatever we think today, he actually believed he was doing the right thing. He believed he was helping Native Americans by helping them to get to salvation themselves by preaching to the right God and sort of doing it the right way. If all of that wasn't bad enough for Puritan confidence in their own mission, right, their own favored status as the chosen people, the King of England revoked the Massachusetts Charter in 1684. They had also been a private company that had a charter colony without sort of the commitment to profit seeking. At least technically speaking, on paper, they were a charter colony. But the King of England revoked it and created the Dominion of New England 2 years later. And if you see the map there, that whole gold area, which includes not just New England, but goes into New York and New Jersey, this was met with opprobrium on the part of Puritans across the board, because it watered down their power, watered down their influence. New York and New Jersey didn't have a population of Puritans. I mean, maybe a few, but not very many. So it meant that the Puritans are now just kind of one group in this much larger political unit that's been created. So Massachusetts is an individual colony, Plymouth is an individual colony. Those are out, at least so it seemed. But in 1691, the royal government in London had a sort of change of heart. They didn't give the charter back, which many Puritans in New England still lamented, but they did make it a royal colony now. So, like Virginia, for different reasons and kind of in a different process, it went from being a charter colony, or colonies in this case, to being a royal colony. I'm talking about Massachusetts Bay primarily here, but the other New England colonies were pulled into this as well. Lastly, then we get to the Salem witch trials, maybe the most talked about event in all of 17th century English, colonial history, all the colonies. I don't know what event gets more attention than this. There's lots of books on this subject, and they kind of keep coming out. And it's a fascinating series of events episode. But it wasn't the first time there'd been an outbreak of witchcraft hysteria. The Puritans, in a sense, were obsessed with witchcraft, obsessed with the devil, which is, working for the devil. Why? Well, I think it has something to do with their chosen people belief and how fervently they held on to it. If they're the chosen people, I'm not saying you have to accept that they were, but they believe they were. If they were the chosen people, right, then God, when God wakes up in the morning, not that God does wake up in the morning, I was presume he's kind of always awake, but he wakes up in the morning, what's the first thing he's going to do when he's looking down at the world, his creation down there? He wakes up every morning and looks at the world. Well, who's he going to be focused on? His chosen people. So he's going to go right to Massachusetts, Boston, or whatever, and say, how are they doing today? So, of course, if the Puritans are the chosen people of God, the only ones on earth, God is going to sort of give them special attention. But it would also follow then that the devil or Satan would be giving special attention to the chosen people of God, because he's trying to thwart humankind in its relationship to God. So that the devil would wake up in the morning and look down at Massachusetts, just that he'd be trying to destroy the settlements, civilization, and religion there, where God would be trying to create it. So it's kind of like the Puritans believe there's this sort of cosmic struggle, going on in New England between God and the devil, to see whether the chosen people are going to be able to survive and thrive and set an example for the rest of the world. So if you believed all this, this seemed to be of the utmost importance, globally. So it's not surprising that there were lots of cases of witchcraft accusations and some trials. Between 1647 and 1692, there were 61 prosecutions for witchcraft. I believe that's just in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Could be New England-wide, I forget now. Only 16 were found guilty, but that's a lot of prosecutions. But the Salem episode was exceptional. It was the largest, by far, outbreak of witchcraft hysteria. It was also the last, by the way. It does appear that those who prosecuted this, political leaders and religious leaders alike, kind of saw the error of their ways too late for the 19 people that were executed, but before this happened again. So there never was another witchcraft kind of hysterical, outbreak of hysterical fear over witchcraft again. But this was the sort of big culminating events from many smaller ones like it before. And if the Puritans were already reeling from their charter being pulled, from the divisive conflicts, bloody conflicts with Native Americans, with the Halfway Covenant, this really, I think, shook them. The fact that it happened at all could be seen as a sign that they're really questioning now their own status with God, whether they're in God's graces or not. They're really sort of worried that they might not be saved, because this is, of course, an extreme reaction to events that didn't seem like much by our standards today, anyway. So this Salem series of events, this way of the people in New England seeing sort of witches and witchcraft everywhere, the devil everywhere, is kind of a good example for all that could go wrong with Winthrop's vision as a city upon a hill, and sort of a growing, I think, loss of confidence that we're in declension. What happened? Apparently, two young women experienced sort of fits, choking sensations and pain in the limbs after they were sort of under questioning by adults and by quote unquote experts. After they and some other girls had been caught kind of out in the woods doing incantations and practicing magic. It might have been witchcraft. The line between magic and witchcraft is not an easy one to draw. And by the way, when I say witchcraft, I don't mean to say that I believe that witchcraft exists in the sense that the the incantations that they do has an outcome, has an effect. It is true that there are people that practice witchcraft in the sense that they did go through the various ceremonies trying to get the results, or just curious to see if there would be results, but not necessarily getting them. So I don't believe that witchcraft has the intended effect. It is true that people practice it. Were the girls here practicing it? Possible. Kids sometimes do things they're not supposed to because it sounds kind of tempting and fun and slightly dangerous. So that probably was innocent, even if it was witchcraft. They didn't really realize what they were, playing with. At least from a social perspective, this would get them in hot water. But indeed, it did. But it's when the two women started experiencing fits and sort of went unconscious. Could be an example of hysteria, as one of the great current psychiatrists in America at Johns Hopkins University talks about in his most recent book. But when doctors could find no explanation, some began to think, oh, this could be possession by the devil. This could be witchcraft that we're talking about here. And then that idea started to spread and take off, and you see real hysteria and panic breaking out. The turning point came when a slave a slave girl or woman who was sort of part of that group admitted to practicing witchcraft. Whether she actually did or not is, I think, not entirely clear. In those days, people sometimes, admitted crimes so they wouldn't get punished further, or they'd get the punishment over with. So it's not clear whether she actually did. It's quite possible she did not. But then a plethora of others claimed affliction as well, and started to, go through the kind of at least the motions or the reality of being unconscious or going into fits. And this was then seen, we really do have possession by the devil going on here. The being possessed by the devil meant that while you were unconscious, the devil was kind of in your soul, fighting with your soul, or fighting with your soul to try to sort of get it over to his side. And so if you were possessed, it didn't mean that the devil had won already, necessarily. It meant that the struggle was going on between you and the devil, sort of inside of you, inside of your head. But it was actually believed to be something true, not just some sort of fiction or figment of the imagination. Most people believe this actually to be true, partly because they've been told it for decades, passed down from generation to generation, all the way back to Europe, because there were witchcraft trials and executions and outbreaks of hysteria there as well. So accusations and panic then spread like wildfire. People pointing the finger at everybody else, sometimes to get the authorities off their back. People were sometimes asked who else is involved in this, and you might think, if you're being questioned and suspected, that if you just give them a name or a couple of their names, that they'll go talk to them and put them under pressure and leave you alone. And so sometimes you might be lying to save your own skin and saying, yeah, I saw that that person over there, they were also sort of possessed by the devil as well. I saw it with my own eyes, in an attempt to sort of divert attention away from yourself, which would be somewhat understandable.